The following presentation is made possible by a grant from the Southwood County Historical Corporation, 543rd Street South, Wisconsin Rapids, Wisconsin.
Paul Gross here, and it pleases me to bring you part 3 of my After the War series, Our Recent Past. The thought occurred to me that in a few years folks will no longer think of it as Our Recent Past. So let me make it clear right now that this film refers to all of us who on the past January 1st ushered in the 21st century. And just so you future viewers understand, for example, we felt very proud as a nation when in the 60s our space program finally passed the Russians, who had commanded a strong lead in space. And when on July 20th of 1969 we landed 2 men on the moon. The event drew the largest TV audience ever, estimated at over 600 million worldwide, a record that has never been broken. For a brief period, the United States was everybody's hero, like the lady in Russia who gently caressed the fender of a reporter's Chevrolet and with a smile remarked to the owner, "American, isn't it?" By the spring of 1971, a piece of the moon was actually located in central Wisconsin when NASA displayed this large moon rock in the science building at the UW Stevens Point. Join me now as we explore our recent past. This Wisconsin Rapids story begins with our camera located at the corner of 8th and Apple Streets. Many will remember that a small but very busy red and orange drive-up root beer stand was once located on this corner. The little seasonal establishment was a favorite meeting place for students from nearby Lincoln High School, and besides root beer, other favorites included sandwiches and ice cream. Here, a little person enjoys a baby beer, a complimentary offering to small children accompanied by an adult. And now we move a few blocks north on 8th Street, showing the intersection at East Grand Avenue and a year 2000 view facing northeast as we dissolve back in time to the way the area appeared in 1970. The building farthest from the camera on the northeast corner was a gas station and an automotive service center that for many years was owned by the Carl Polanski family. In 1970, the Polanskis moved to a new facility further south on 8th Street, where they owned and operated the local Buick dealership. As the camera pans left, it's quite apparent that 8th Street was narrower than it is today. Next is a year 2000 view of the same intersection. We are facing east. This is how it appeared in 1970. On the left of the picture, we again see a portion of the Polanski building. It was actually located on the site of the present-day Key Savings Bank. As the camera pans to the right, a gas station and a Western discount store come into view. Obviously, 8th and Grand was a prime location when one considers that there was a gas station on each of the 4 corners. It was also in 1970 when the beautiful new McMillan Library was opened to the public. Prior to that time, our local library, then known as the T.B. Scott Library, was located at 543rd Street South in the building that is now home to the Southwood County Historical Museum. Even prior to this location, the library had occupied the old City Hall building at the junction of 1st and Baker Streets. Now let's step back in time once again to 1967, when the new $4 million Riverview Hospital was dedicated. The 1967 dedication had been seriously delayed when on November 5th of 1966, as the new hospital was nearing completion, a fire broke out, resulting in $500,000 damage to the structure. Most of the damage was smoke-related. At the dedication, one could not help but reflect upon some of the earlier hospital facilities, like this building that still served the community in the 30s, and the newer addition that carried us through the war years and right up to the 1967 dedication of the present facility. Since that time, numerous expansion projects have been initiated to increase the capacity and efficiency of Riverview Hospital and to accommodate the latest technologies in medical care. Also in the late 60s, it was very apparent that the city needed a fire station on the west side of the river. This old station had served the city well since 1918. However, industrial and residential expansion on the west side dictated that shorter response time was urgently needed. And in 1969, a new fire station at 17th and West Grand Avenues went into service. "13 years later, another fire station at 1511 12th Street South was dedicated. The old abandoned station on 2nd Street North was sold to no owners, and it was turned into a restaurant. Ironically, in June of 1994, the building was destroyed by fire. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had an old steam locomotive parked in the city zoo, a memento of the past. This old steamer had once been in service on the Green Bay and Western Railroad, and it spent its last working days for Consolidated Papers. Nicknamed Old Smokey, a local fund drive was initiated to preserve the old steamer for future generations to enjoy. Money for the project was raised by selling shares in the Old Smokey and Zoo Park Railroad at $1 each to pay for the cost of painting and the tedious task of moving the locomotive into the zoo. In the fall of 1957, the old engine stood proudly in its new home, but over the years, due to weather and extensive damage by vandals, it was no longer practical for the city to maintain the old steamer, and it was given away to a very appreciative railroad museum at North Freedom, Wisconsin. This was the scene on October 10, 1987, as our last steam locomotive was removed from the zoo park. Here it is shown on a siding waiting to make the journey to its new home at the Mid-Continent Railway Museum. There, it was cosmetically restored, given its original name and number, and is still on display for folks to appreciate. Speaking of railroads, this was the old Chicago and Northwestern Railroad Bridge as it appeared in 1976, located on the exact site of today's Riverview Expressway Bridge. The city acquired the right-of-way after the railroad abandoned the route. Plans for a new bridge and expressway soon followed. This was a sturdy old bridge as it appeared in July of 1978. In the fall of that year, the rails were gone and the bridge was blocked off. The old landmark was doomed. By May of 1979, piers for the new bridge were already in place. Just 1 month later, some of the massive girders were set, and the old bridge was just a memory. By late summer, the last span of the new bridge was swung into place. Now workmen would prepare for the 4-lane deck that would carry the endless stream of traffic as we know it today. Finally, in the fall of 1980, the bridge and roadway were completed, and in September, the dedication took place. A parade of dignitaries rode down the new expressway to a reviewing stand where numerous speakers praised the accomplishment and at last cut the ribbon that officially opened the route to the public. Many changes were taking place in the city back in 1977. For starters, the Mead Inn, as it was then called, was about to embark on a massive expansion program. Part of the plan called for closing off a portion of Oak Street from the intersection of 4th Street to the intersection at 5th, which would provide much-needed parking for the enlarged hotel. Here we are looking east, showing Oak Street as it was. The portion in red identifies the west end of the area that was closed off. From the opposite direction, facing northwest, the old Oak Street can be better appreciated. The White House on the right was one of several that were removed or demolished to make room for what is now the Jackson Street extension as it is today. In the center of the picture was the old Calvary Baptist Church. It was actually located on a triangular plot of land. 4th Street would be behind the building, and the angular street connecting Oak was called Market Street, which ran down to the courthouse area. This church was demolished, as well as a small brick church on 4th Street, just visible behind and to the right of the foreground church. This view shows the 4th Street Church, St. John's United Church of Christ, during demolition. Some of the stained glass windows from the churches were used as decor in the dining area of the new Mead. Other changes in the area were all part of a master plan that would move traffic quickly from the Jackson Street Bridge on a congestion-free route to the Grand Avenue and 8th Street area. Meanwhile, the Mead Hotel expansion project was well underway. On September 11th of 1977, some of the footings had already been poured, as is apparent in this photo. It was a snowy New Year's Day in 1978, and this was the scene as the building began to take shape. In spite of snow and cold, by the middle of March, the steel work was completed, and workers topped it off with a traditional tree. Progress continued through 1978, and in March of 1979, the new addition was ready for guests. At the time, who could have foretold that yet another expansion project would be undertaken in 1998? The year 1980 brought still more change in our city. On the West Riverbank, Consolidated Paper's new office building was under construction, soon to take its place as a new landmark in the area. Just across the river on the east bank, the view as we know it today was still the location of older landmarks that had stood the test of time and were about to be removed in that fine summer of 1980. It all started on a Sunday afternoon when traffic on Grand Avenue was at a minimum. For spectators, it was an emotional experience when that first bite was taken out of the old Sugar Bowl building. As the weeks passed, the rubble was hauled away. the memories of this once bustling area gradually faded into the past. I was especially fortunate to get this shot. The gentleman shown here was Joe Hagan. Mr. Hagan owned and operated the local J.C. Penney store. He had been with the Penny Company since shortly after it was founded, and we are told that his penny store was one of only 2 in the country that were still privately owned. One can only imagine the memories that must have crossed his mind as he watched his old penny store crumble before him. And then there was the Daly Building, built by John E. Daly way back in 1897, at a time when their inventory included even bicycles, paint, and wallpaper. The old neon sign almost fought to stay in place. But it was the sign on the roof that gave workers the biggest headache. You see, someone in the family descendants had requested that the sign be salvaged, and the wrecking crew did their best to save it. By the time the snow was flying, folks were taken up in the presidential race, and demolition of the area was still in progress. On November 4th, Ronald Reagan was elected president, defeating Jimmy Carter by a landslide. Then came the spring of 1981. This is the way it was on May 10th as the new Riverside Park began to take shape. And before the summer ended, the project, much as we know it today, was completed. While all of this was going on, more demolition was taking place on the west side of the river, where the old Nash block was being cleared for parking. The project included removal of all of the buildings between Grand Avenue and Johnson Street. Back in time, these buildings had been home to the Nash Hardware, a Whippet Automobile Agency, the Daily Tribune, Normington's Cleaners, and the Wisconsin Valley Creamery. As it turned out, there was still more demolition to be done on the east side of 2nd Street, where the Wood County Bank would demolish old buildings and make room for a modern new addition. These old buildings were once home to a clothing store, a hardware, a meat market, a paint store, and a Ben Franklin store. The end result of the project was a fine new bank building. This was the beautiful old Grand Avenue Bridge as it appeared in 1984. Engineers were concerned that salt and weather had taken their toll on the structure, and had even gone so far as to fence off a portion of the north sidewalk for fear that it would fall into the river. Plans called for replacement of the old structure, and demolition began on a cold winter day in 1984. As the work progressed into 1985, it was obvious that the old bridge was not about to give up easily. Needless to say, each day sidewalk superintendents frequented the area and recalled their personal memories that each could relate to the old bridge. Many asked, isn't it possible that the old bridge could have been refurbished? At last, the new Grand Avenue Bridge began to take shape. Work continued through the better part of 1986, and many were disappointed at giving up the beautiful old arched bridge for one that looked like it belonged out on the interstate. Be that as it may, on September 14th of 1986, the dedication took place. The ribbon was cut, and once again, Grand Avenue traffic could cross the Wisconsin. Just for the record, this was the fourth bridge to be built on this site since the end of the ferry service in 1866. In 1980, a committee of local citizens was formed to come up with a plan to restore the old tower clock that had once served the community and to give it a new home. Right from the start, the Memorial Clock and Bell Tower Committee decided that no tax money would be used to fund the project. Very early in the venture, a local architect, Jerry Feith, offered his services at no charge. Armed with one of the first drawings of the proposed tower, the committee went to work on fundraisers. Over several years, there were street dances, concerts, a pig roast, a big band banquet, and countless other promotions to generate revenue. One especially memorable event was a WFHR radiothon at the Elks Club. At the time, Morris Matthews was running for mayor against incumbent James Kubishak. As part of the entertainment, they sang a song together. I don't recall the name of the song, but it was something like, "Anything you can do, I can do better." School bands and others joined in the broadcast. Stanton Mead, Philio Nash, and other local notables took part as Arnie Strope put questions to them on airtime. At last, in the fall of 1988, the day the committee had worked so hard for arrived with a groundbreaking ceremony at which Governor Tommy Thompson was the keynote speaker. Construction of the tower started almost immediately. The solid base on bedrock actually required more concrete below ground than is visible above. In late December, the massive precast components began to arrive, and in spite of bitter cold, construction moved ahead. As the large dials were swung into place, folks realized this clock is no toy. It was quite eventful to see the cap of the dial house swing into place, the last piece of a precast puzzle. Much interior steelwork and welding remained to be done, and a gentleman by the name of Gene Forstner stepped forward and offered his services and that of his crew. Charging only for materials, Gene installed the floors, the ladder system, and the clock linkage. At last, in the summer of 1989, the Memorial Tower was dedicated as Mayor Carl Greenway participated in the ribbon-cutting ceremony. Once again, the clock, now well over 100 years old, functions perfectly, except for an interruption by winter ice or a power failure. Every community is unique in different ways, and Wisconsin Rapids is no exception. It's not just the brick and mortar, concrete and steel. It's also government, people, and individuals. Individuals like Don Cheeseborough, for example, who over the years has entertained us with his big band and jazz music sound. Well known throughout the state, there's nothing Don enjoys more than entertaining local gatherings like at this jazz presentation at the McMillan Library, or the big band sound of Don and a group of area musicians at a local restaurant. With those beautiful notes, we conclude our After the War series. It has indeed been a pleasure. So what's next in our history of Wisconsin Rapids? Quite simply, you've told me. Many folks have said, I'd like to see more of, for example, the old streetcar line or the first ridiculous day, the train service or floods, and so on. So I've decided to call my next series History by Request, and I'd appreciate your input. Until next time, I'm Paul Gross. Thanks for listening.